Today in this video we're uncovering a story that sounds almost unreal. A moment when German soldiers rubbed their eyes, stared across a fog-covered river, and simply couldn't believe what they were seeing. Tanks. Floating. It was April 1945 on the western banks of the Rhine. The war was burning toward its end, but no one knew that yet. The river was a cold gray boundary, Germany's last great natural defense. The morning mist was heavy enough to muffle the sound of boots and artillery. German sentries stood watch, exhausted, eyes scanning the still water that seemed to promise one more day of safety. And then, out of that silence, came a low hum. Not aircraft, not boats, something else entirely. The men strained their eyes, and there, through the mist, shapes began to move. Bulky, upright, unbelievable. Tanks. To the men on the eastern bank, it looked like the impossible. Sherman tanks, not on a bridge, not on barges, just gliding across the surface of one of Europe's mightiest rivers, their guns pointed inland, their hulls hidden beneath tall canvas screens that rippled with the current. For the first time, German troops were watching machines that had turned water, one of history's oldest boundaries, into a highway. The tanks didn't stop for bridges. They made their own roads out of the river itself. Some soldiers froze. Others opened fire, bullets sparking off the river's surface. It didn't matter. The Shermans reached the bank, dropped their flotation screens and roared forward, their caterpillar tracks drowning out disbelief. What the Germans had witnessed that morning was one of the most extraordinary creations of World War II, the Duplex Drive Sherman, better known as the DD tank. But to understand how these strange floating tanks came to exist, we have to rewind to a time when the rivers of Europe were seen not as highways but as walls. Let's step back to 1943, to the workshops, the testing lakes, and the mines that refused to let water be a boundary. Rivers, the natural fortresses of Europe. From the very first planning sessions of the Allied invasion of Europe, water was the enemy no less than the Wehrmacht. Every strategic map of France, Belgium, and Germany looked the same. Dense blue veins of rivers and canals slicing through towns and farmland. Each one promised delay, casualties, and a chance for the Germans to reset their defense. The Allies knew that once they landed and advanced off the beaches, the landscape itself would turn against them. From the Orne to the Seine, from the Meuse to the mighty Rhine, every crossing would demand feats of improvisation. Bridges could be destroyed in minutes. Temporary structures took days under fire. A delay of hours could mean the difference between breakthrough and stalemate. In Britain, planners and engineers worked under immense pressure to give the coming invasion not only manpower, but mechanical ingenuity. They had learned hard lessons from Dieppe in 1942, where tanks had drowned in surf and engineers had bled out under coastal guns. The Second World War's industrial momentum was beginning to shift toward problem-solving as much as firepower. And one man would embody that philosophy more than anyone else, Major General Percy Hobart. Hobart was an eccentric visionary, brilliant and abrasive in equal measure. He had been sidelined before the war, considered too unorthodox only to be recalled by Winston Churchill himself, when the Army desperately needed new ideas. His 79th Armored Division, nicknamed Hobart's Funnies, was a rolling workshop of contraptions that defied convention. Flail tanks that cleared mines, bridge-laying tanks that unfolded like mechanical origami, flame-throwing tanks that breathed fire into bunkers. Among these funnies was a machine so radical it looked absurd, a tank that could swim. It was officially called the Duplex Drive Sherman, or DD for short. The name came from its twin propulsion systems, tracks for land, propellers for water, but in essence it represented a philosophy: never let nature do the enemy's work. Early amphibious experiments had existed before, trials with canvas boats and rudimentary floating tanks, but nothing truly combat-ready had reached the field. The British firm Vickers Armstrongs, under engineer Nicholas Straussler, devised the pivotal innovation: a collapsible floating screen made of toughened, rubberized canvas, inflated by an onboard air system. When raised, it gave enough buoyancy for a 30-ton tank to float. When lowered, it folded against the hull, allowing the tank to fight normally once ashore. The concept seemed outlandish. Imagine taking a heavy steel beast that weighed 30 times more than an infantryman and expecting it to bob safely on open water. Yet in tightly controlled trials across English lakes and rivers, The idea proved surprisingly sound. The sight of a Sherman gliding across a pond, propellers buzzing gently as its turret peaked above a thin barricade of canvas, was both comic and astonishing. Still, few within the high command shared Hobart's enthusiasm. A single torn screen, a wave over the bow, or a malfunctioning bilge pump could send the entire machine to the bottom in seconds. For tank crews, it meant trusting not only their training, but the raw physics of flotation. Many called them Donald Ducks, a nickname that lingered long after their first trials. Yet as spring 1944 approached, necessity hardened imagination into order. The Allied invasion force needed a way to land armor in support of infantry on beaches without ports. The DD Shermans would be the first wave's secret weapon, capable of swimming ashore under their own power, bypassing the chaos of landing craft jammed under German fire. The plan: launch them from vessels several kilometers off the French coast, and have them swim the rest of the way to the sand. It was a bold gamble, the kind of operation only desperation and confidence in technology could breed. Still, this innovation did not exist in isolation. Behind every floating tank lay a logistical revolution. New training centers, secrecy protocols, and a new way of thinking about warfare itself. And that deeper transformation, the quiet preparation that turned a mechanical trick into a battlefield advantage, reveals just how far the Allies were willing to engineer victory. The Allied army was not merely preparing for an invasion. It was building a machine ecosystem designed to beat geography itself, innovation hidden in plain sight. Through the winter and spring of 1944, the fields and quarries of southern England became laboratories of amphibious warfare. In small isolated lagoons along the Dorset coast, especially at Fritton Lake near Norfolk and Studland Bay in Dorset, crews of the 79th Armored Division learned to pilot what many soldiers half-jokingly called tanks in bathtubs. Their training schedule was secret, exhausting, and dangerous. Trainee crews had to master the delicate balance between buoyancy and panic. A Sherman fitted with a canvas flotation screen looked fragile and top-heavy, its hull buried beneath a skirt inflated by compressed air. Each tank carried twin propellers hooked to the engine's power takeoff, steered by the tank's own tillers. Inside the hull, men sat in air that smelled of oil and rubber, surrounded by deafening engine noise, trusting that thin fabric wall between them and the freezing lake. They practiced launches from landing craft, timing the exact moment the canvas screen needed to be erected before the tank left the ramp. Crews learned to read water like sailors, watching currents, estimating wind, gauging wave height. Too little air pressure and the screen sagged. Too much and it tore. Every launch was a delicate ritual of procedure and nerve. Mistakes meant sinking. Nicholas Straussler's original design had undergone dozens of modifications by then. Stronger screen stays, faster bilge pumps, emergency release valves, even inflatable supports shaped like cartwheels around the turret ring. Each adjustment came from bitter trial rather than theory. Engineers discovered that the heavy American-made Shermans floated better than the smaller British Valentines first used for testing. Soon the American M4A1, with its rounded cast hull and stable weight distribution, became the amphibious standard. Yet secrecy wrapped this project tighter than a naval code. Men were warned never to discuss DD tanks outside training grounds. Their true purpose was hidden behind bland paperwork titles, special equipment for assault engineering battalions. At the same time, amphibious rehearsals took place under heavy camouflage nets, their engines muffled by earthen berms to prevent curious eyes or German reconnaissance aircraft from glimpsing something impossible. Even within Allied high command, confidence remained uneven. Some naval officers considered the whole concept a lethal distraction. Others believed the tanks could dramatically reduce beachhead casualties. The U.S. and British formations interpreted the deployment differently. British planners would land DD tanks on Sword, Juno, and Gold beaches in shallower seas. The Americans would try them at Omaha and Utah in rougher surf. The Atlantic itself would have the final say. By early May 1944, vast convoys assembled along England's south coast. The funnies were dispersed among standard armored brigades so that any capture or air reconnaissance would not reveal a pattern. Each DD Sherman bore special waterproofing and rolled canvas but otherwise looked ordinary while parked. Only when its screen rose, wrapping around the tank like a tall collar, did its second identity appear. Across the Channel in occupied France, German defenders prepared in ignorance. Their focus was on fortifications, anti-tank walls, and the destruction of any bridge or causeway. The European river and canal system had long been part of Germany's defensive imagination. From the narrow Orne and Dives near Caen to the Meuse farther east to the Rhine itself, every waterline was treated as a potential last stand. The idea that tanks could swim across these barriers simply never entered their calculations. By contrast, the Allies treated rivers as puzzles to be solved. Engineers envisioned operations where amphibious armor would cross before pontoon units could arrive, seizing the far bank before explosives could be set. When planners studied post-Normandy routes through northern France and Belgium, they already saw these floating Shermans as bridge replacements in motion. No weapon achieves surprise forever. The power of the DD Sherman lay not only in what it could do, but in what the enemy thought it could not. It embodied a principle older than warfare itself. Disguise strength as impossibility. And soon, the moment would come when that illusion met its revelation, on a morning when steel would meet surf, and the history of river warfare would be rewritten in salt spray and smoke. Next came the perspectives that gave this technology its full human and tactical meaning. The angles through, which innovation turned fear into advantage. The invention was metal and rubber. The courage was flesh and bone. No training film could prepare a tank crew for what a DD launch truly felt like. Inside the hull, the air was close and damp, the floor plates trembling beneath every piston stroke. The driver, by far the most vulnerable, sat just inches above a black shifting current, watching through narrow, waterproofed periscopes smeared with spray. A leak, even a small one, sounded like death working patiently. Before dawn on 6 June 1944, those sensations became reality for men of the British 13th 18th Hussars and the American 741st and 743rd Tank Battalions. The sea was rougher than the manuals allowed, yet orders remained fixed. On those dark heaving decks off Normandy, commanders had to trust that their physics-defying tanks would do the impossible. Crews inflated their screens, checked bilge pumps, clutched St. Christopher medallions, and watched the landing craft gates drop. Each launch was a leap of faith measured in heartbeats. Many recalls describe a surreal calm once afloat. The world became muffled, distant, as if they had slipped into a dream. Propellers churned and spray hissed up against gray canvas walls. The tank behaved more like a submarine than a land weapon. It had to be coaxed, not commanded. For those moments, courage took the shape of engineering obedience. Men who had trained as soldiers found themselves testing the boundaries of physics and nerve. When they reached solid ground again, if they reached it, they carried not just war stories, but the weight of having trusted ingenuity more than luck. The DD Sherman's tactical logic was elegant in outline, chaotic in execution. In the broader language of invasion, infantry was supposed to seize the sand, engineers to follow with obstacles clearing, and armor to provide firepower once a bridgehead existed. D-Day inverted that sequence. The DD tank was meant to arrive first, already firing while infantry landed. This meant tanks swimming toward enemy guns that were firing long before the men could return a shot. British planners at Sword and Juno beaches treated DDs as synchronized instruments. Timing mattered. Launch too far offshore and they would sink. Too late and infantry would die waiting for armor support. Stopwatch precision met weather that refused to cooperate. Yet in the ideal scenario, the DDs provided suppressive fire within minutes of surf contact, their shells striking pillboxes and AT guns that might otherwise rake landing craft as they grounded. In American sectors, the theory faltered under heavier seas. Many of the 741st Battalion's tanks at Omaha were launched nearly 5,000 meters from shore, against calm water recommendations of 3,000 meters maximum. Of 29 launched, only a handful survived the crossing. Others sank within minutes. On Utah and the British beaches, however, calmer tides made the concept work spectacularly. Infantrymen cheered at the sight of Shermans swimming in toward them, guns already cracking while still half afloat. The differences between these sectors underline the DD's tactical paradox: extraordinarily useful under perfect conditions, catastrophically fragile otherwise. Yet even partial success paid strategic dividends. Wherever they reached land, the effect was instantaneous fire support and psychological strength. a living wall of moving armor where none was expected. The core of the Duplex Drive system was mechanical simplicity disguised as wizardry. Around a standard M4A1 Sherman's upper hull, technicians fitted a folding waterproof screen about 4 feet high, reinforced by inflatable vertical struts. An onboard compressor inflated these within minutes before launch, producing a drum-tight wall of canvas. The air trapped inside provided about 40% additional buoyancy, beyond what the tank's own displacement could offer. At the rear, dual propellers connected through a transfer gearbox to the drive shaft. The driver could shift power between the tracks or the screws using a differential lever. Steering was controlled through the same tiller system used on land, small track inputs that pivoted the hull even while afloat. The turret stayed functional, though limited in traverse by the raised screen. Inside, emergency drills were exacting. Every crew carried inflatable lifebelts, distress markers, and a release knife. If the screen tore, regulations ordered an immediate lower-to-land configuration, though in deep water that meant little more than accepting the inevitable. Bilge pumps could handle minor leaks, but many fatal sinkings came from wave overtopping. When a single surge spilled over the 5-foot screen, the weight of water collapsed the fabric inward, drowning engines within seconds. Tests on lakes had shown that operators could reach 5 to 6 knots on calm water, impressive for a 30-ton vehicle. In open sea, wave height of more than 2 feet was already perilous, so each DD operation was an equation of forecast, tide, distance, and hope. Crucially, the DD concept transformed Allied engineering doctrine. It blurred the line between naval and ground equipment. Tank crews learned seamanship. Naval officers learned to trust mechanical oddities. The project represented a new category of weapon, the hybrid machine, whose existence would redefine operational freedom. That doctrine would soon echo far beyond the beaches. As the war plunged inland toward the great rivers of Western Europe, commanders began to imagine something even bolder, using these same swimming Shermans not as invasion craft, but as unstoppable crossing instruments. For every German gunner who witnessed tanks emerging from river mist, that evolution inside Allied thinking was invisible but decisive. Because what first astonished them was not only what they saw, but what they had never considered possible. To the Germans, the river itself was supposed to fight for them. German infantry and armored units had grown accustomed by 1944 to the idea that the Allies possessed overwhelming material power. But certain natural facts had always seemed on their side: rivers, tides, demolished bridges, and mud. When the first reports came across field telephones that tanks were crossing streams without bridges, officers assumed translation errors or panic. At Normandy, few defenders actually witnessed the DD landings directly. In the weeks that followed, though, wrecked amphibious Shermans washed up along the tide lines and photographs began circulating through intelligence offices. Reports described floating armored vehicles, equipped with air-inflated walls. An absurd phrase in German, bureaucratic prose that nonetheless marked the first confirmation. By the time the front approached the Seine and later the Rhine, any river was considered potential invasion ground. Yet disbelief lingered. In many accounts, forward German units did not know such tanks even existed until they saw one climbing out of the current. Post-war interrogations of German officers showed a repeating phrase, unmöglich, impossible. This disbelief had tactical consequences. Commanders delayed demolitions, assuming the Allies would need engineers to bridge crossings. Others withdrew armor to reserve positions rather than waste it defending a safe water boundary. Those hesitations cost days at critical moments. The German playbook had always expected rivers to be time buffers. The Duplex Drive erased that clock. Reacting effectively proved nearly impossible. Anti-tank guns could destroy DD Shermans once ashore, but hitting a partly submerged bobbing target was another matter. Machine gun fire usually shredded the canvas too late, when tanks were already in shallow water. For soldiers who had spent years believing terrain would protect them, this new threat carried a moral sting deeper than tactical surprise. If rivers could no longer defend them, then nothing, neither nature nor concrete, was sacred on the European battlefield. Every military innovation carries two weights, the physical and the psychological. The river-crossing Shermans delivered both. Strategically, Allied planners could now treat Europe's water system not as obstacles, but as avenues. By eliminating the need to wait for bridging engineers, armored divisions could maintain operational tempo. Surprise regained its place in warfare, a rare luxury in 1944. When analysts later reviewed the campaigns from Normandy to the Rhine, they realized that these amphibious capabilities allowed a pattern of momentum few historians noticed at first. In August 1944, near Vernon and Oiselle, experiments in reusing DD tactics across the Seine gave British and Canadian troops a fluid advantage before German rearguards could consolidate. Months later, at the crossing of the Rhine in Operation Plunder, the same principle achieved spectacle-level surprise. While the sky filled with parachutes and artillery thunder echoed, amphibious Shermans simply appeared on the far bank, preempting defensive fire. These moments combined engineering with theater. Each successful crossing projected an image the Germans could neither duplicate nor easily counter, an enemy whose machines ignored geography. Such perceptions battered morale as effectively as bombing raids did. Allied commanders understood this. Reports and briefings emphasized the propaganda value. Photographs of tanks swimming rivers circulated in military newspapers to showcase Allied ingenuity. What impressed one's own troops demoralized the adversary. The message was clear. Resistance, however determined, could not keep physics on its side. On the tactical map, this confidence translated into relentless pursuit. The Wehrmacht's pattern of falling back behind a river line lost meaning when divisions knew the enemy might cross before dawn, using what they mockingly called Gummipanzer, rubber tanks. Humor barely disguised the despair. Strategic flexibility became a moral weapon, a kind of psychological bridge the Allies could build at will. There is a moral layer to every technological leap in war. Admiration coupled with unease. The Duplex Drive Sherman symbolized both. On one hand, it was a pure expression of human creativity at its desperate best. Bridging armies across rivers had always claimed terrible tolls. Now minds had conjured a machine that carried itself. It turned the destructive arithmetic of war, tons of steel, yards of water, into a solvable equation. The sight of a tank gliding over darkness and surf carried the same eerie beauty as an aircraft's first flight decades earlier. On the other hand, for those in its path, that same ingenuity meant new forms of helplessness. Weapons that had once relied on terrain for mercy found no refuge. The moral center of the DD story lies between these facts. Rivers once symbolized separation and safety. After 1944, they symbolized vulnerability. Soldiers of every nationality understood instinctively what that meant. Obstacles define courage. Remove the obstacle and both defender and attacker lose an old certainty. German defenders realized that even nature might betray them. Allied troops learned that victory often demanded entrusting life to devices that looked ridiculous. And in that contradiction, the absurd and the brilliant welded together, lay something distinctly human. The Duplex Drive did not end battles on its own. Many sank, many failed, and even at their best they were transitional machines. Yet they captured a truth larger than technology. Wars are not won merely by numbers or firepower, but by the refusal to accept that a barrier is permanent. Across the Channel, across the continent, those floating shapes carried more than guns. They carried proof that imagination could be as decisive as any weapon. Their presence, half miraculous, half mechanical, set the stage for moments when disbelief would shatter into history. To the nights when German observation posts heard only the hum of unseen machines. And the next dawn rose over rivers no longer loyal to defense. From that realization grew the crucial sequence of events when invention met combat head-on, the turning points that made the impossible practical, and the fantastic. Routine June 6, 1944, 04:45 hours. The English Channel churns like a cauldron under a gray, indifferent sky. A wind from the west lashes spray across the decks of the landing craft lined abreast of one another. Small mechanical islands packed with men, engines, and steel. Beneath canvas covers, the Duplex Drive Shermans wait in silence, inflated screens trembling, air compressors hissing like breath through clenched teeth. Orders crackle through headsets on borrowed frequencies. Launch at 2,000 yards. It is earlier and farther than the manuals ever recommended. One after another, tanks of the 741st Tank Battalion slide down ramps into a sea still swollen from the night storm. Propellers churn but surf surges higher. Several float briefly, then tilt. The overloaded waves break over the bow, collapsing the canvas walls. Men claw at hatches, engines sputter, and before shore is even in sight, the channel claims them. 27 of the 29 tanks launched at Omaha vanish into the depths, some within sight of other landing craft who can do nothing but stare. For those who survive the plunge, the crossing is agony in real time. Saltwater invades seams. Visibility fades to a few meters, and men navigate by compass headings through a sea that wants them dead. The DD Shermans move at barely walking speed while shells whistle over the waves. Exact coordinates blur into instinct. Left until the periscope view finds something vertical. Right until the shoreline stops being horizon and becomes land. At Omaha, failure seems complete. But the survivors who make landfall, a handful of tanks led by Lieutenant Jimmy Monteith's group, begin firing within seconds of hitting the sand. Each round from their 75mm guns slams into German emplacements, breaking a rhythm of slaughter that had pinned down the first infantry waves. One tank's movement draws enemy fire away from hundreds of men clinging to sand ridges. Another destroys a machine gun nest that had seemed untouchable. In that chaos, even a few floating Shermans change destiny. Farther east, the channel's temper softens. On Sword and Juno beaches, the British landings unfold closer to expectation. The sea is calmer, visibility better. The 13th 18th Royal Hussars release their DD Shermans only a few hundred yards from shore. The tanks maintain formation, propellers humming in eerie unison. Within 6 minutes, they climb the sandbanks under small arms fire, screens collapsing on cue. Infantry cheer as green smoke signals mark success. Sherman guns crack, pulverizing the first line of bunkers. One British corporal later described the sight as watching miracles unfold from under gunfire. In these sectors, Hobart's gamble pays off. Infantry gain immediate mobile fire support and psychologically something even greater. The myth of German invulnerability begins to tear at its edges. The defenders had prepared for men. They found mechanical phantoms emerging straight from the sea. Some German survivors later admitted they thought new amphibious assault tanks had been built overnight. Others believed special barges concealed tanks until the moment of landing. Almost none imagined the tanks had swum there unaided. By midday, the beachheads connect into a single grinding organism: steel, wounded men, churned sand, and pluming smoke curtains. The DD Sherman's legacy is already written in blood and confusion. Simultaneously, one of the day's great losses and great successes. Out of roughly 120 tanks launched across all beaches, just over half reach fighting ground. But those that do perform with quiet, decisive brutality, the improvisation continues inland. Crews whose flotation gear is torn use the canvas as extra camouflage. Others salvage still buoyant hulks to ferry ammunition through surf zones. It is warfare at its most experimental, part machine test, part survival test, where technical innovation becomes indistinguishable from instinct. For the Germans observing these scenes through binocular slits, disbelief shifts to elemental fear. Their defensive plan had rested on crushing waves of men before armor could join them. Now armor arrives by water itself. The calculus of defense collapses. Rivers and tides no longer mean reprieve. When evening falls over Normandy, beachheads widen and command tents flicker under blackout lamps. Reports trickle upward. Some officers call the DD experiment reckless. Others call it genius tempered by tragedy. For Major General Hobart and the men of the 79th Armored Division, waiting to deploy their next machines, the lesson is harsh, but vindicating. Amphibious armor is no longer theory. It is bruised, battered proof that the impossible, done imperfectly, still outperforms perfection never attempted. In that one day, the Duplex Drive Sherman completes its first metamorphosis, from secret project to legend, from experiment into symbol. Yet its story does not end with the surf of Normandy. It will follow the Allied advance inland, to every waterline the retreating Wehrmacht deems uncrossable. From the rivers of France to the Rhine itself, where disbelief will be reborn as panic. And on those darker, colder crossings, the illusion of natural safety will dissolve forever beneath the wake of floating steel. After the landings of June 1944, the concept of floating armor transformed from a daring experiment to a battlefield expectation. The Allies advanced eastward across a patchwork of rivers, each one smaller than the Channel but no less a test. The Seine, the Somme, the Meuse, all names now etched with human sweat and technical ingenuity. By autumn, the Duplex Drive Shermans had evolved from secret curiosities into essential instruments of Allied momentum. Through France and into Belgium, rivers served as both obstacles and opportunities. Whenever engineers stumbled upon a destroyed bridge, tank commanders considered the new option almost casually. Can we swim it? The answer often depended on supply and nerve. Maintaining a DD Sherman was punishing. Air hoses split, propellers fouled, bilge pumps jammed with silt, yet morale remained astonishingly high. The crews who had survived Normandy's surf became evangelists of the improbable. They had seen engineering miracles turn tide and terror, and they carried that quiet faith wherever the front line met open water. By March 1945, the war's geography led to its final and greatest crossing, the Rhine. For Adolf Hitler, the Rhine was more than a river. It was a mythic boundary of defense, a line every German soldier was told to defend or die upon. Its width, up to 400 meters in places, its fast spring current and its pre-sighted artillery zones made it a natural citadel. Even the most optimistic Allied planners doubted an easy passage. Bridges were methodically demolished by retreating German forces. Pontoon construction under artillery observation promised heavy losses, but the Allies had quietly been rehearsing alternatives. At training sites along the Maas and Wall, DD Sherman regiments refined the choreography: inflation drills, night launches, shallow water steering, rapid deflation on landing. Word spread among reconnaissance units that certain armored battalions could float themselves across. To the men who had never witnessed the device, it sounded like rumor. To those who had, it sounded like insurance against stagnation. Then came Operation Plunder, the Rhine crossing in late March 1945. On the western bank near Ries and Wesel, Allied forces assembled under skies thick with the roar of aircraft. Paratroopers prepared for Operation Varsity overhead, while artillery lined up on both sides of the river in eerie synchronization. The Rhine's far bank glittered with German muzzle flashes, defenders of the 8th Parachute Division watching a horizon poised to erupt. At 2100 hours on March 23rd, the bombardment began, 5,000 guns, shaking the ground into a single vibration. By midnight, assault craft and amphibious vehicles poured toward the eastern shore. Among them, under canvas covers, rested several squadrons of Sherman DDs, waterproof to their turrets, propellers tested one last time against the current. Just after WWII, they launched. To witnesses, the sight was an echo of Normandy, but larger, more orchestrated. One after another, the tanks slid into the black surface under cover of smoke and starlight. The Rhine, wide and muscular, surged around them, but their propellers bit the flow. Gunfire slashed the surface, tracer lines ricocheting off the water like molten rain. Still the tanks moved onward, slow, methodical, almost serene. German sentries along the far bank, roused by artillery chaos, looked into the mist, expecting assault boats. Instead, through gaps in fog, they saw the impossible silhouette of turrets above rippling cloth. The reports later scribbled by field communications describe it simply: Panzer erwarten nicht Fähre, sondern schwimmen selbst über. The tanks do not expect a ferry. They swim over themselves. The shock fractured coherence. Gunners hesitated, not trusting their eyes. Defensive artillery adjusted too late. By the time fire corrected, the first Shermans had already grounded on soft Rhine mud, screens collapsing gracefully. Mud turned under their treads as engines roared to full torque. Within minutes, German bunkers that had expected hours of immunity found Allied barrels turning toward them at point blank. Photographs from the aftermath show surreal contrasts. Amphibious tanks half-coated in fresh mud, propellers still dripping river water, parked beside captured German trucks emblazoned with slogans about defending the fatherland at the Rhine. The mythic line had broken, not with pontoon engineers and frantic construction lights, but through quiet mastery of buoyancy and belief. The Duplex Drive Shermans did not cross alone. They came alongside storm boats carrying British and American infantry, and amphibious buffalo vehicles ferrying supplies. Yet the image that dominated soldiers' memories was of tanks calmly swimming through a river the Nazis had promised would halt them. Under floodlights, the spectacle seemed to erase the logic of terrain itself. For German troops along the Rhine, that vision was the psychological breaking point. Memoirs describe officers weeping, not from sentiment but from the exhaustion of certainty undone. If tanks could swim across their country's oldest defensive line, then the war's final truth had arrived. Industrial and imaginative power, not faith, would dictate the end. By dawn of March 24th, bridgeheads were expanding on the eastern shore. Thousands of German prisoners marched west, stunned that the famed river barrier had fallen in a single night. Among the captured communications from the sector were frantic notes. The enemy's tanks move as boats. Impossible. Request guidance. There was no guidance left to give. On that morning, hours before the paratroopers of Operation Varsity descended, Allied tanks sat dripping and alive on German soil, their propellers glistening like mechanical fins. The Duplex Drive's journey, from secret British lake trials to the greatest river in Europe, had come full circle. That crossing marked not only the physical breach of Germany's last line, but also the symbolic collapse of its wartime mythology. The river that had been destiny for centuries had become merely another road. And in that transformation, water to road, fear to mastery, lay the final proof that innovation, multiplied by resolve, could do what artillery alone never could: make the impossible obey. Those crossings left behind shattered embankments, flooded fields, and a sense that the laws of war had shifted forever, yet their consequences rippled deeper, shaping the campaigns and the minds of men who now believed no obstacle was absolute. The true measure of that impact would unfold in the months and years that followed, in ruins and rebuilding alike. The Rhine crossing of March 1945 marked the beginning of the end for the Third Reich. By April, the Allies were streaming eastward, encountering less of the fanatical resistance that had been expected. Lines that on paper were meant to hold for weeks gave way within days. The amphibious component of the operation, the DD Shermans included, proved decisive not just in terrain but in tempo. The phrase "storm the river" was replaced by "move through it." From a military analysis standpoint, the numbers tell the story's quiet precision. Out of approximately 200 DD tanks prepared for deployment during Operation Plunder, roughly 90% reached the far bank intact. The river was wide, the water swift, yet the coordination that had eluded earlier attempts now held. Experience had distilled the chaos of Normandy into professionalism. Each crew had been trained through endless night crossings, each failure studied, each machine refined. The DD Sherman that entered the Rhine bore little resemblance in behavior to its 1944 ancestor. Its screens hardened, its pumps strengthened, its crews veterans of both sea and shock. The impact went beyond the figures. Infantry morale soared when they realized armor could follow them almost anywhere. In the long months of European campaigning, infantry divisions had grown accustomed to waiting, vulnerable, for engineers to assemble bridges under fire. Now progress moved almost without pause. Across the Rhine and into the Ruhr Valley, the idea of momentum, that elusive constant in total war, finally belonged to the Allies entirely. Reports from field commanders glow with an understated satisfaction. To them, amphibious armor was the ultimate proof of evolution under pressure. "What began as a lunatic contraption is now a soldier's best friend," wrote one British officer in April 1945. For many, this shift was personal. Technology no longer merely served theory. It saved faces they knew. Still, the price had been heavy. The DD program's early losses continued to darken its legend. The drowned tanks of Omaha Beach remained on the seabed as markers of risk and necessity. Mechanical perfection was never reached, only an acceptable balance between daring and death. Yet to the strategist studying combat efficiency, the lessons justified the pain. The crossing of the Rhine without delay had compressed campaigns and spared countless men, who otherwise would have faced entrenched river defenses for weeks. The German reaction, by contrast, revealed a fractured disbelief turning to resignation. Wehrmacht situation reports following Operation Plunder read more like autopsies than strategies. Commanders cited creative mechanization as the decisive factor behind the failure to hold the Rhine. In essence, they blamed imagination, a resource their own depleted industrial base could no longer match. Captured diaries from German engineers at Wesel show a certain grim respect. One entry, hastily penciled on a scrap of field map, reads, "The enemy's machines obey no natural limits. Ours obey our orders and therefore fail. It was less an accusation than a eulogy for an older military faith. For decades, German military thinking had equated engineering with fortification: hold, block, defend. The Duplex Drive had rewritten that creed. Engineering could mean movement. Meanwhile, Allied propaganda units seized the moment. Newsreels broadcast images of tanks gliding through the Rhine at sunrise, their turrets breaking the waterline like whales surfacing in an iron tide. The films played in London, New York, and Toronto within weeks, accompanied by steady, authoritative narration that equated technological daring with moral certainty. The tone suggested that the Western world's triumph sprang not only from bravery but from curiosity, the courage to build strange machines. On the ground, for the exhausted crews, victory felt simpler. They had conquered an element. They had crossed one of history's great natural dividers and found only mud and farmland on the other side. For the first time since Normandy, many tankers allowed themselves to believe that the war might truly end soon, and that their own hands had built the proof. Yet endings in wartime never stay contained. The Rhine's crossings had broader consequences still to come: logistical, psychological, and industrial, a chain reaction that reached far into the peace that followed. With Germany's heartland opened after the Rhine breach, Allied columns surged eastward toward the Ruhr industrial basin and beyond, driving wedges between collapsing Wehrmacht formations. Behind them, engineers and analysts cataloged what the novel armor had achieved and what it might teach. The lessons would shape Western military thought for decades. Field reports described how Amphibious, Shermans often arrived in better mechanical condition than ordinary tanks forced through improvised bridge crossings. Their waterproofing meant fewer breakdowns. Their self-contained propulsion systems allowed unexpected mobility in flooded terrain. Commanders noticed secondary advantages, too. DD tanks could ferry supplies or wounded across smaller rivers even when conditions precluded bridging. Soldiers began referring to them informally as steel ferries. From these observations grew a doctrine shift. Allied amphibious engineers saw that mobility was no longer architecture, constructing bridges, but chemistry, a direct conversation between machine and element. Every future crossing operation, planners concluded, should consider whether the vehicle, not the bridge, might be the answer. That mental inversion represented one of late war history's quiet revolutions. In the short term, however, the Duplex Drive concept stopped evolving. The war ended too quickly for further experimentation. When victory was declared in May 1945, workshops that had perfected amphibious Shermans fell silent. Their crews dispersed. Many of the surviving DDs ended in scrapyards or training depots, stripped of propellers and screens. Yet in their brief lifespan, they had bridged not only rivers but eras, from static siege logic to mobile, adaptive warfare. German engineers who examined captured DDs after surrender were divided between professional admiration and bitter irony. Some wrote detailed technical summaries that would later inform Soviet and NATO amphibious vehicle research. Others merely shook their heads. The device had solved a problem they had not thought existed. For the Reich's devastated industry, copying such complexity was no longer an option. The technology race had already passed them by. Intelligence summaries from Allied command in mid-1945 reflected this intellectual momentum. The 21st Army Group concluded that specialized armor has provided a measured increase in tempo disproportionate to its numbers. In plain English, a few dozen floating tanks had accelerated whole campaigns. That realization guided later NATO doctrines where speed and surprise, not sheer mass, defined deterrence. The civilian world, too, felt the echo. The same principles that made a Sherman float inspired engineers designing amphibious rescue vehicles and disaster relief ferries in the post-war years. Watkins Glen and Detroit factories quietly borrowed research from the Funnies archives to waterproof engines, insulate electrical systems, and develop compact propeller couplings. The moral, as always, migrated from battlefield to blueprint. Among veterans, the legacy remained tangible. For many surviving crews, their strange machine symbolized trust in design, in comrades, and a notion of courage expressed through mathematics and steel. Reunions in the 1950s and 1960s often included recovered photographs of half-submerged tanks at Normandy or the Rhine, described with laughter that barely concealed memory's ache. They remembered the fear and the absurdity equally, rolling into salt water knowing that logic and luck were indistinguishable for the next few minutes. For Germans who had faced them, the sound lingered differently. The whine of propellers across fog, the realization that every presumed limit could dissolve overnight. Letters from former soldiers to Allied counterparts decades later often mention that single astonishment: "We could not believe a tank could swim." In those few words rests the greater impact. Between disbelief and recognition lay the entire shift of the 20th century, from defensive certainty to technological bewilderment. By the 1960s, nations on both sides of the Cold War fielded amphibious vehicles whose design routes traced directly to those British lakes of 1943 and the brown waters of the Rhine 2 years later. The D.D. Sherman's descendants bore new names and new armor, but the idea was the same: mobility is faith. Impossible until it is practiced. Fritton Lake, once sealed under wartime secrecy, became a quiet memorial site. Visitors might still see faint depressions in its banks where tanks trained, the mud bearing imprints of innovation long submerged. Simple plaques mark the place where engineers taught machines to float and, in doing so, taught soldiers to distrust the word impossible. That combination of practicality and wonder forms the afterimage of those last campaigns. Men drying their uniforms beside amphibious hulks, rivers golden under sunrise, the war's noise fading while the lesson remained. Because the Duplex Drive story does not end with victory parades. It persists wherever a designer confronts nature and refuses to accept defeat. And as Europe began to rebuild its bridges in peacetime, it did so knowing that once, bridges had become almost unnecessary. The reflection on that truth, how ingenuity reshaped both war and imagination, belongs to history's quieter moments, where engineers, veterans, and rivers all keep their own counsel. Some wars are fought in silence, between the mind that accepts a boundary and the one that refuses it. By the final spring of 1945, Europe's rivers had ceased to be barriers. In the ruins beside them, men realized that the most decisive victories of the war had not always shouted. Some had hummed softly beneath the surface, driven by engines and imagination. The Duplex Drive Sherman was never the most famous weapon of the Second World War. It lacked the menace of a Tiger tank or the glamour of a Spitfire. It was odd, clumsy, even comedic in appearance, a steel giant wearing a rubber skirt. Yet within that ungainly frame lay a quiet revelation that the secret to progress in war or peace is the refusal to let nature or habit dictate possibility. It embodied something more than tactics or mechanics. It reflected humanity's restless habit of questioning limits. Faced with rivers too wide, currents too swift, obstacles deemed impenetrable, ordinary engineers and soldiers decided that the answer was not to go around but through. They found grace in buoyancy, courage in calculation, and hope in canvas and compressed air. For the German soldiers who first watched tanks rise from misty water, disbelief gave way to awe, and eventually to the realization that ingenuity, not sheer force, was rewriting warfare's grammar. For the Allies, those machines became more than tools. They were proof that persistence could turn ridicule into salvation. Years later, as Europe knitted itself back together with real bridges and peaceful commerce, the image of those floating Shermans lingered in collective memory. School children paddled boats in the same lakes where the prototypes once trained. Farmers plowed fields that had once been temporary harbors of iron. The lesson remained as clear as the rivers that once divided the continent. Obstacles endure only until imagination touches them. In that light, the Duplex Drive Sherman was less a machine of destruction than a symbol of transition. From static world to mobile one, from certainty to adaptation. Its legacy survives not in the number of battles it won, but in every mind that looked at an impossible problem and thought, perhaps it could float. The mist has long lifted from the Rhine, the Orne, and the Norman beaches. Their waters run quietly now, carrying reflections instead of shrapnel. But somewhere within those currents drifts the echo of propellers turning under canvas. A reminder that even in humanity's darkest hours, the will to invent was never drowned. And that will, ultimately, is what carried civilization to the far shore.